So we have Representative Travis Couture with us today, and weeks like this one really drive home for me why getting rid of daylight savings time is a bipartisan issue, because you lose an hour on the weekend and then you go into the weekend. It's the middle of session and the legislative, session, and you're up until what, like 3:30 a.m. at night?
Yeah, I don't think I got crawled into bed till like 4.
Oh
Oh
my
my God.
Yeah.
God.
Yeah, it's
Wow.
it's brutal, but we're just gonna power through the day here and hopefully get some sleep tonight.
Okay.
Not an energy drink guy?
I used to be until like I got kidney stones once and then I kind of quit.
Like,
Our editor is giving the hey, let's move along. The representative is busy signal. There's a hand signal for that. It's time for Sound Politics. Welcome to Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone.
and I'm Libby Denkmann.
And we have been working to get Washington State Governor Bob Ferguson on this show for weeks. Hasn't worked out yet, but we may have got the next best thing. A Republican.
Wow. I thought we were actually trying to get the governor on the show.
No. I'm
You're
kidding.
like driving him away.
I'm kidding. But that's how some Democrats are talking right now. And also, I'll just say, Governor Ferguson is used to it since he was at his county council days. People have been calling him a Republican right now, even more than ever, though, because of Ferguson's aversion to taxes and plans to cut things like food bank funding. But here's why I bring it up. Not because Ferguson is a Republican, just for the record, but because on and off, he's championed some Republican bills, like limiting the emergency powers his predecessor used during the COVID emergency. And this might be the biggest opportunity for Republicans to influence state policy since they lost the state Senate during Trump's first term.
So we wanted to get a Republican perspective on taxes, the budget hole, all the stuff going on in Olympia right now. Representative Travis Couture is the Republicans' budget lead. He represents Washington's 35th legislative district, which is in the Southwest Sound, Mason County, and some others. Hi, Representative Couture. Thank you very much for being on the pod. It's great to have you here.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Sorry, I'm not Bob Ferguson. He might get you more views, but we'll try to keep it good.
Let me tell you what, you are not a second choice. You are a first choice. So thank
That's right.
you. I want to ask you first about the governor. That story in Olympia that we alluded to is that Governor Ferguson is a lot more popular with Republicans in the legislature right now than Democrats because of the way he's been talking about taxes and the powers of his office. A poll of Washingtonians last month from DHM Research found that Ferguson's approval ratings had dropped to 42%, down from 56% in November. And some of that was driven by Democrats being unhappy maybe with their choice. Of course, that's just a state poll. It was from a Portland firm of all things. What do they know? But what are your thoughts on Ferguson's first few months in office and the way that he has been reaching across the aisle?
Well, frankly, there's a lot of people in the middle, right? And Washington State has, for a handful of years, maybe more now, saw just a tremendous lack of balance in our state government. And I don't view Bob Ferguson as a conservative per se, but when he got elected governor, this is just my thought that he wanted to be able to be a governor for everybody. That's at least what he says. And in order to do that, you got to kind of find a centrist lane and you got to find ways to work with both sides of the aisle. And that means actually standing up for things that matter to both sides of the aisle. And so I'll give him credit for that. There's many things that my side agrees with him on right now. I mean, you brought up a few, skeptical of new taxes, wants to cut our state budget down to size. We've got reckless spending, record spending in our state budget. And, there's some other policy related things too, like you mentioned, emergency powers. That's something Republicans have wanted since the pandemic to fix. And then also, there's some other helpful things. Got a housing crisis right now. And he wants to make sure that government is efficient and gets permits done on time and everything else so that we can actually build a housing supply in the state of Washington. So I think that although there's going to be probably points where myself and my caucus, disagree with the governor along the way. I think that's natural. But, he actually took the time to come down and speak to our whole caucus.
Hmm.
I never once saw Governor Inslee do that since I've been here. His director of OFM, the Office of Financial Management, kind of running the budgetary things. I have a weekly meeting with the director. We have a governor in office now who is engaged in the legislative process, whereas before with Governor Inslee, it seemed like that just didn't exist. And it just feels nice that there's a governor, even though in the opposite party and with still many disagreements, that they just live on the same planet as the rest of us.
That's fascinating. I want to ask about this thing that you and the governor agree on, but you're up against a lot of Democrats who disagree. The $15 billion deficit in the state budget and how to deal with it. We had one of your Democratic colleagues on the show a couple weeks ago, Christine Reeves, and she said, what I hear a lot when it comes to the budget, not just from Democrats, but, progressives, activists, they say rich Washingtonians pay way less than poor Washingtonians because of our funky tax setup. So instead of cutting programs, let's look at making them pay their fair share first. You probably hear that a lot. What do you say to that?
I think that it's a false promise. So Governor Inslee came out with what he calls his wealth tax, which is an unrealized capital gains tax. And of course, we already have a capital gains tax. So this would be like a second version.
And just for people, it's a 1% tax on stocks, bonds, other things over $100 million. That's the wealth tax that Inslee put forward.
Yeah, except for this time you don't really have to have the asset, right? I mean, it's stocks and bonds that, they fluctuate day by day in the market, and you probably, might not get a return if it crashes, right? If your stocks go down later on. And I'm even some pretty progressive powerhouses
Yeah.
like
Nick Hanauer.
Nick Hanauer,
Yeah.
he said it was a boneheaded idea. And it is, because the false promise of it is that what you're going to see, much like you did with our current capital gains tax, is capital flight. I mean, what they're trying to tackle is the most sophisticated taxpayers in our whole system, right?
Hmm.
And they have the ability and the funds to move their assets to different places or to different states. And that's exactly what they'll do. And on top of that, I just believe an unrealized capital gains tax is purely unconstitutional. They haven't actually done that yet here in the legislature.
Right.
What they have been doing is proposing new fees and taxes that are regressive in nature. For example, there was a counter proposal by House Democrats to fund police, right? But it includes that the only way you could get funding for police is if you increase your sales tax locally. Democrats have been arguing for a long time that the sales tax is one of the most regressive in the nation. And then I just kind of have a problem, I guess, with saying that you only deserve public safety if you raise your own taxes. It's a core key function of government. And on top of that, if you're going to raise revenue for it, why are you trying to raise the most regressive revenues? The wealthy in our state are also sometimes the people who are creating big enterprises that hire a lot of people and create jobs, family wage jobs, and bring capital and development for projects, for housing, for so many infrastructure projects and other different things. And if you have that capital flight, then it moves away. And where we've seen this just recently is our current capital gains tax, where they estimated we would get a lot more than we actually did. And we see shrinking revenues in our capital gains tax. And that played at least some of a factor in our shrinking revenues, where we still have the high record high revenues, and the revenues are still going up, but just not as much as anticipated. And a lot of that is because of the capital flight involved in the capital gains tax. And a famous aspect of that is you saw Jeff Bezos move his assets to another state. And so I think that the wealth tax is probably like the biggest false promise of taxation as far as what it would bring back. And I think that even the Governor Inslee proposal vastly overestimates what they would even receive if they implemented that tax.
I do want to say there are, studies out there that, show that some capital gains taxes, at least the ones I've seen, don't have an impact on people fleeing. Obviously, there's anecdotes like Jeff Bezos, and you're right, the revenues are dropping. I have seen some evidence for the idea that fewer folks who are selling off capital gains will move to Washington State, that there is sometimes a drop off in people moving here because of capital gains taxes. But that's just based on what I've seen. I do want to talk about how the state closes this big gap if it's not going to be taxes. The governor has floated, furloughing state employees 1 day a month for the next 2 years, letting some COVID era programs, right, that relied on one-time federal funding go away. Food assistance we mentioned. How would you and the Republican Party like to see the state budget cap closed? What's your plan or proposal?
It's a tough process because there's so many line items in our $72 billion budget that it takes a lot of time to comb through, and we're doing that right now. And I think that my end game at the end is that I agree with the 2/3 of Washingtonians that, as polled recently in a couple different polls, that say, hey, we want to reduce spending and not increase taxes. They were very clear. That's almost a mandate level of how clear they were about that. And I think that in a way, the governor is trying to be responsive to those needs. It is somewhat a difficult task, but if you can imagine that if we just go back to the budget of a biennium ago, you could dang near just balance the 4-year outlook based upon that alone. So it sounds difficult, but it just takes difficult decision making. And one of the things I've been talking about, and I think even the governor talked about it before session, was that we have to have priorities of government. And that's not new. That's something that decades ago, when Gary Locke, then Governor Gary Locke, was faced with a similar problem, he instituted priorities of government and solved their budget crisis back in the day. And that just means that you fund the things that are the most important, your constitutional or your key core functions of government first, like your paramount duty, K-12 education, and then you move your way down to the things that aren't as important. And in the last couple of years, when we're talking about starting basically in 2020, 2021, we booked a lot of spending we simply did not have the money for. Maybe some of it was those one-time COVID relief funds that we turned into ongoing programs. And then we expanded other programs as a result of it as well. And if you can go back to those years and try to identify what is the delta, what is the difference between then and now, and what is absolutely critical and important, you can actually make a lot of headway. And when you have a $72 billion budget and growing, there is a lot of opportunity to find government efficiency and to find waste and to try to manage that and to try to get it out of our budget so that you can dedicate those resources to the people who need it most. One of the problems I have with our budget process in the last couple of years is that we're trying to make it a little bit for everybody, but not enough for anybody. And what I mean by that is, like, we spread the peanut butter really thin, but we never fully fund things. We only partially fund things. And so everyone is always wanting more.
You're talking about like pre-K, or what? Like, what's an example of that?
It could be a host of things. It could be anything from our schools to indigent defense. Right. We have a huge lack of public defenders in our system, and that is a critical part of our public safety process. We're 51 out of 50 per capita for police, right? I mean, we're not solving the problems. And when I talk to my constituents and I talk to a lot of people, it seems like we spend an incredible record amount of money in our state budget, but still there's so many people needing at a time when the caseloads are actually going down.
Representative, I just want to get a little pushback here on the idea of a mandate, because I think that Democrats would make a case that they have a mandate to look at new revenue. People in Washington seem to be okay with the Climate Commitment Act, which is arguably a gas tax, a backdoor gas tax, the capital gains tax, the payroll tax that funds the state's long-term care program. All of those survived initiative efforts to repeal them, and the votes were not particularly close. When you say that the cuts are, something that people want to see. What would you say to the idea that, voters sent a clear message last year that they are okay with these new sources of revenue and appreciate the kind of programs that they fund?
Yeah, I think that for the programs you're talking about, which were on the ballot, I might argue that some of those ballot languages were confusing, but at the end of the day, what I believe what voters said is that we approved these already existing programs, including the taxes or fees or costs that they generate. But what I don't believe that they said when they voted for those things on the ballot is that we approve new taxes,
Hmm.
right? And I think that's the major pushback and the major disconnect.
I mean, the capital gains tax is sort of, again, the wealth tax that was proposed, as you say, has other critics. There's also the payroll tax that's been floated, but that seems in line with the capital gains tax, which voters were, even in conservative parts of the state, voters were pretty open to the capital gains tax in the last election.
Sure. I mean, they voted to keep the capital gains tax, but that capital gains tax is also a lot different than an unrealized capital gains tax. I mean, we're functionally talking about what the state Supreme Court called an excise tax. I'd still call it an income tax. At the end of the day, those were on assets that you've sold, right? This unrealized capital gains tax. I mean, if you try to budget on an unrealized capital gains tax where it's been tried other places and struck down by courts, you're setting yourself up for a big trap. Because if you budget and program our state programs and agencies and everything else that people need based upon a tax that may be kicked out the door by a court, or maybe even if it isn't kicked out of the door by the court and has shrinking revenues, just like our current capital gains tax does, because of capital flight and whatever other reasons there are, then you're setting yourself up for failure. And this is just another example of how we've got ourselves into the place we're in today, where we have volatile taxes that we can't rely on. And then also where we're booking new programs based upon future assumptions that are wildly unrealistic, like a 4.5% revenue assumption where we never actually hit 4.5% revenue in the second biennium of the 4-year outlook. And that's a practice that's been going on for a long time. But the difference between, 2.7 or 3% and 4.5% is $1 billion. So if you've got $1 billion on paper that didn't ever actually exist, and then you didn't get as much in revenue as you thought you were going to get, but you booked a bunch of new spending, which is exactly what they're doing this session and what they've done in previous sessions. They're booking new spending based on money that only exists on paper, but not in real life. That's a recipe for disaster. And so we have to be more fiscally responsible and think these things through. And I'll just say that Governor Ferguson absolutely agrees with me on that 4.5% revenue assumption. It's one of the things that he brought out multiple times before the beginning of the session. That was a bad budgeting practice and materially contributed to the fact that we're in this big budget deficit right now. And so what I would also just wrap this up to say is that we've had one party rule where the minority party is not, as the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, the Republican budget lead in the House, I am not allowed in the room with Democrats like they are with the capital budget and the transportation budget, or even in the operating budget in the Senate, right? I'm not allowed in the room to negotiate and even try to help out. That cuts out 3 million Washingtonians that my side of the aisle represents, and I think that's wrong.
So I have another budget question, but it's not about the state budget. I'm thinking about, this question of cutting budgets. Cutting budgets can be hard. If you take a hammer, you might break something some constituency really likes. And I wanted to ask you about, federal cuts, particularly just potential Medicaid cuts on the national level, because one of your big wins last year was passing a bill that expanded access to Medicaid for children with complex medical needs. Republicans want to cut $880 billion from the deficit in the next decade, and now I'm talking about the federal deficit nationwide. And Medicaid is not, mentioned by name in their legislation, as far as I've checked. But the math, and I'm not a math person, but when I look at the math, doing that without any Medicaid cuts doesn't seem very workable. Are you nervous about Medicaid cuts? Do you think there should be some cuts to it as someone who has worked on Medicaid in this state?
Work requirements, something like that.
If I'm being honest with you, I don't really follow the federal stuff too close. I'm so wrapped up in the state level stuff. But for a long time, what I believe is that if you're on Medicaid, you're essentially almost a ward of the state. It's the state's responsibility to take care of you and to make sure that you can have access to health care and get the care that you need. But we've went over 20 years without rate increases to Medicaid just on a state level. Our medical providers are suffering as a result of it, our health carriers, and also our patients, right? And that's the problem is, if you want to have health care that is affordable and accessible, every time try to expand it in this area and that area, it becomes a death of 1,000 cuts and it makes it really expensive. We haven't raised rates, and my side of the aisle has said that, hey, this is a general fund obligation. This is one of those key core functions of government we should take care of before we take care of a lot of other things. We have proposed over at least the last couple of years to use general fund to increase Medicaid rates so that we can have more providers, more doctors, more nurses, whatever in our hospitals and have more access for patients as a result of it, more beds that are open. But right now, the only solution on the table here in Olympia is a covered lives tax that will essentially tax everybody else so that we could pay more to providers to increase access to Medicaid. But it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's robbing Peter to pay Paul. You have to take more from people who are already suffering with high healthcare prices in order to expand Medicaid, when I believe that should have been a general fund obligation. That should have been something we funded for Medicaid patients from the general fund first before we funded a lot of other things. And I don't know about the federal rules and how that's all going to turn out.
Yeah. I want to ask you, I know you're not following what's happening on the national level too closely. I am. I read in a story about you that your wife is a Democrat, and I'm really curious if we could end on a personal question. What are those conversations like at home? Is she following what's happening nationally or just talking to people? I'd love to be like a fly on the wall at your kitchen table, but since I can't, give us an idea of what those discussions are like.
What's
right
it
now.
like being in a mixed marriage?
It's great. Here's the thing. Political polarization has kind of told people that we have to hate each other if we don't agree. And what I like about my marriage is that we don't have to agree on everything, but we still love each other and we still support each other. And I think more people can model that and act like that in society. We don't have to agree on everything, but we should lead with some respect for each other and try to put each other. For me and my wife, we got to put each other in each other's shoes sometimes and try to see it from the other side.
So I guess that makes you kind of the Mary Matlin to her James Carville.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, and but oftentimes we find that if we can sit down and discuss, we actually can agree, right? And that is one of the things I feel that has put a tool in my toolbox to make me an effective legislator here is all the conversations with my wife and learning how to talk to people across the aisle and on the other side has made me effective in learning how to talk to people over here in Olympia and to try to get things done for either my district or for the state of Washington.
And we really appreciate the conversation today as well and the way that you've been talking us through these issues. We do have to wrap. Representative Travis Couture, ranking member of the House Appropriations Committee, so lead budget maker on the Republican side in Olympia. It's been really fun, and I so appreciate having you here, and I hope we can have you on again soon.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
That's it for Sound Politics today. Today's show was produced by Hans Anderson. Our editor is Gabe Spitzer. I'm KUOW politics reporter Scott Greenstone.
I'm Libby Denkmann, and this show is only possible, just a reminder, with your support. Please consider a donation. There's a link in our show notes or at kuow.org/politics to give a little bit to help us keep this show going strong. Thank you.